As some of you already know, my name is Michael Overhola, and I am variously an author, editor, and journalist by trade. And I would like to welcome you to our presentation on a maritime history of the Philippines. And my hope with this lecture, with any sort of lecture tying in with a destination that we're going to be arriving at very soon, is that the things we talk about are going to tie in with and enhance the things you see on your excursions today and tomorrow, the places that you go in Manila or around the Philippines. That would be my hope, that I'm able to enrich your experience a little by giving you some background so that when you look at the walled city of Intramuros, you'll have a better understanding for where it fits in with, say, the Spanish reign over the area or the Philippine-American War or whatever. So that is our goal with our talk today. All right. As a glance at the graphic we can see here demonstrates, Philippine history is diverse, complicated, and extensive. We've got less than an hour, really about 45 minutes, for the structured portion of our presentation, so we must necessarily compress and simplify things a bit while endeavoring to not lose the essence of our subject. We have specified that we're approaching the history of the country from a maritime point of view, but as it consists of a collection of islands, that only helps us so much. So let's jump right into it and cover as much as we can. And I have this graphic up mostly so that you can get a sense for the complexity and diversity of Philippine history. There will not be a test at the end. You don't have to be absorbing this overly much. I just wanted to give some sense for the subject that we are going to be approaching in a streamlined fashion. And we're probably not going to end up having time for a lot of question and answer today at the end of this presentation because there is a lot associated with it. But I am available to have a drink in Cellar Masters. My wife and I are usually there by about 6 o'clock in the evening to have a glass of wine and chat with anyone who shows up. The earliest archaeological evidence for people in the Philippine archipelago is the 67,000-year-old Calauman of Cagayan and the Neolithic era Angano petroglyphs in Rizal, both of which appear to suggest the presence of human settlement prior to the arrival of the peoples who came to dominate the islands. So a prehistoric history that goes back a long time. And we can see the location of the Neolithic, late Stone Age era Angano petroglyphs in Rizal here, these caves and overhangs. The people known as Negritos were early settlers, and they were followed by speakers of Austronesian languages who began to arrive in successive waves, probably beginning about 4000 BC, displacing earlier arrivals. So the Austronesian speakers who came to dominate the islands arrived about 6,000 years ago, give or take. By 1000 BC, the inhabitants of the Philippine archipelago had developed into 4 distinct kinds of peoples: tribal hunter-gatherers concentrated in forests, warrior societies that practiced social ranking and ritualized warfare and roamed the plains, petty plutocracies in the mountain ranges of Luzon, and the principalities that grew up along rivers and seashores and had economies based on trans-island maritime trade. It was also during the first millennium BC that early metallurgy is believed to have reached the Philippines via trade with India. So by 1000 BC, we're looking at an incredibly diverse series of societies, at least 4 different types of peoples spread out throughout the islands. And the ones living on the coasts and seashores are trading throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia. So very cosmopolitan, very diverse. Around AD 300 to 700, so 1,500 years ago, give or take a century or two, the seafaring peoples of the islands traveling in wooden boats known as balangays, one of which we can see here at left, a reconstruction of one, began to trade with Indianized kingdoms in the Malay archipelago and the nearby East Asian principalities, adopting influences from both Buddhism and Hinduism. So these were two early cultural and religious influences on the development of the cultures of the Philippines. Eventually, the maritime-oriented harbor principalities grew into a colorful variety of kingdoms, rajanates, Kadachuans, Huangdoms, and sultanates, including the Indianized rajanates of Butuan and Cebu, the dynasty of Tondo, the august kingdoms of Masapan and Manila, the Kadachuan of Majaas, the Sinified Huangdom of Maay, the Huangdom of Pangasinan, and the Muslim sultanates of Sulu, Lanao, and Maguindanao. These small maritime nations flourished from the first millennium AD and traded with what are now called China, India, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and were greatly influenced by their religion, language, culture, literature, and philosophy. Remaining settlements were independent communities allied with larger states, necessarily. And the image we're looking at the right is from an ancient book labeled now as the Boxer Codex, and it shows a royal couple from the Kadachuan of Majaas, one of these maritime kingdoms that rose to prominence about 1,000 years ago along the coasts of the Philippines, what we now call the Philippines, because of course that is not what any part of it was known as in that era. Portuguese-born Spanish explorer Ferdinand Magellan landed on the small Philippine island of Hominhan in 1521, claiming it and those surrounding it for Spain. He established friendly relations with some of the local leaders and converted a number of them to Roman Catholicism. He and his men explored many of the islands that would become the Philippines, including the island of Mactan, where Magellan was in fact killed in a battle with a local chieftain. Over the next several decades, other Spanish expeditions arrived, including one in 1543 led by Ruy Lopez de Villalobos, who named Samar and Leyte Islands, Las Islas Filipinas, after Philip II of Spain, Philip II, the King of Spain, a name that was extended to the entire archipelago later in the Spanish era. So this is where we have the first appellation of the name the Philippines, Las Islas Filipinas, in 1543. European colonization began in earnest when Spanish explorer Miguel López de Legazpi arrived from Mexico in 1565 and formed the first European settlements in Cebu. Beginning with just 5 ships and 500 men, accompanied by Augustinian monks, and further reinforced with 200 soldiers in 1567, he was able to repel incursions by the Portuguese and lay the foundations for the colonization of the archipelago. In 1571, the Spanish occupied the kingdoms of Manila and Tondo and established Manila as the capital of the Spanish East Indies. And we're seeing the same model for colonization in the Philippines that we're seeing in Mexico, in South America. These are conquistador expeditions, for want of a better term. These are groups of Spanish officers who have been given commissions by the crown, supported by a bunch of soldiers, conquistadors, and reinforced religiously by a bunch of monks. So the goal is to gain land for Spain and to convert the inhabitants to Roman Catholicism. This is the model that they're following. It's exactly what we see in Mexico and South America and other places around the world. In 1578, war erupted between the Christian Spaniards and Muslim Bruneians over control of the Philippine archipelago. On one side, the newly Christianized Visayans of the Kadachuan of Majaas and the Rajanate of Cebu, and the Rajanate of Butuan joined the Spanish in the war against the Sultanate of Brunei and its allies. And the Sultanate of Brunei is still a nation today. Some of you have heard of the Sultan of Brunei. This is what we're talking about. In April 1578, the Spanish fleet, with a force of 400 Spaniards, 1,500 Filipinos, and 300 Borneans, succeeded in seizing the capital city, the Bruneian capital city of Kota Batu. The Spanish, however, suffered heavy losses due to a cholera or dysentery outbreak, and were so weakened by illness that they decided to abandon Brunei to return to Manila on June 26, 1578, after just 72 days. And this could very well be the reason that Brunei remains an independent sultanate today, that the Spanish ended up having to leave because their forces were too beleaguered by illness. Spanish power was further consolidated after de Legazpi's complete assimilation of the Kadachuan of Majaas, his subjugation of the Raja of Cebu, and Juan de Salcedo's conquest of the provinces of Zambales, La Union, Ilocos, the coast of Cagayan, and the ransacking of the Chinese pirate kingdom of Pangasinan. So we're seeing here successive subjugation or conquering or absorbing by the Spanish of these various independent, at this point mostly maritime, coastal kingdoms and other entities. So the Spanish are consolidating their power, beginning to consolidate their power and establish their presence in the Philippines, more so than anybody else has ever done, in the late 16th century. Ongoing war between the Spanish and the Moros of the sultanates of Maguindanao, Lanao, and Sulu began in this era, and this protracted Spanish-Moro conflict continued well into the 19th century. And just to explain what we're looking at here, on the right, that is Ferdinand Magellan, the European explorer who's credited with discovering the Philippines, what we now know as the Philippines. And on the left, we're looking at a Moro war helmet. So the Moros modeled a lot of their armor and weapons after a point, after what they saw European colonists doing. So it's not a coincidence that the Moro helmet looks an awful lot like a conquistador helmet. So that is a helmet that would have been worn by Moro warriors. And you see this pattern of helmet being worn really from the 16th century right up until the 20th century. And we're actually going to see a 20th century image that shows some of the Moros wearing helmets that look like that. And they were usually made out of brass. They were working in brass, and that's what this particular helmet and a lot of their other helmets and armor were made out of. All right. The fragmented nature of the islands made it easy for Spanish colonization, made it easy for them to follow the model that they had followed in other places, because they could take small entities that were unallied with each other piecemeal. The Spanish then brought political unification to most of the Philippine archipelago, also for the first time, via the conquest of the various states, although they were unable to fully incorporate parts of the sultanates of Mindanao and the areas where tribes and the highland plutocracy of the Ifugao of northern Luzon were established. So even by this era, they're not able to completely consolidate power over the islands entirely. The Spanish introduced elements of Western civilization, such as a code of Western law, printing, and the Gregorian calendar, along with new foods like maize, pineapples, and chocolate. Church and state were inseparably linked in Spanish policy, with the state assuming responsibility for religious establishments. One of Spain's objectives in colonizing the Philippines, in fact, was the conversion of the local population to Roman Catholicism. The pageantry of the church had a wide appeal, reinforced by the incorporation of indigenous social customs and religious observances. This eventually led to a Roman Catholic majority from which the Muslims of Western Mindanao and the upland tribal peoples of Luzon remained detached and alienated in the era that we're talking about. Within 20 years of the conquest of Luzon, a cathedral had been built in the city of Manila with an episcopal palace, Augustinian, Dominican, and Franciscan monasteries, and a Jesuit house. The king maintained a hospital for the Spanish settlers, and there was another for natives run by the Franciscans. The colony's garrison consisted of about 200 soldiers in this era, and in total, it was home to some 667,000 people under the care of about 140 missionaries. So the consolidation of Catholicism was part and parcel with the military conquest of the area. Around 1608, so early 17th century, an English navigator named William Adams contacted the interim governor of the Philippines on behalf of Tokugawa Ieyasu of Japan, leading to the official start of relations between Japan and New Spain. Manila was also linked to Acapulco, Mexico, by galleons that traveled there once or twice a year between the 16th and 19th centuries. So over a 300-year period, Spanish galleons are going once or twice a year between Acapulco and the Philippines. During this period, the Spanish military fought off various indigenous revolts and several external colonial challenges, especially from the British, Chinese pirates, Dutch, and Portuguese. So there's just too much to cover in any kind of detail, but continuously there are ships from other powers sailing into Philippine waters and challenging the Spanish presence there. And this is, of course, happening all over the world during this colonial era. Roman Catholic missionaries converted most of the lowland inhabitants to Christianity and founded schools, universities, and hospitals. In 1646, a series of 5 naval actions, and we can see an image on the right that depicts one of those naval actions. A series of 5 naval actions was fought between the forces of Spain and the Dutch Republic in the Philippines as part of the 80 Years' War. Although the Spanish forces consisted of just 2 galleons and a galley with crews composed mainly of Filipino volunteers, against 3 Dutch squadrons totaling 18 ships, they defeated the Dutch and forced them to abandon plans for an invasion of the Philippines. And how many people here have cruised in the Caribbean before? Just about everybody. It looked like at least 80% of the people here. Just to put things in perspective, I mentioned the 80 Years' War, which took place during the 17th century, predominantly during the 17th century. That's something I talk about a lot in lectures tying in with, say, the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean, because that really was a very important event that happened there. So what we're looking at during this era, during this Spanish colonial era and consolidation of power, is contemporaneous with what they were doing in the Caribbean at the same time. So if you were hearing about Spanish colonization of the Philippines or of the Caribbean, the Spanish battling the Arawaks and taking control of the various islands there, that's happening at the same time as what we're talking about here. And then at left, of course, we could see one of the Japanese trade ships that this treaty with Japan allowed to begin conducting trade with the Philippines. So once again, still, very cosmopolitan and international in many ways. Colonial income derived mainly from trade via galleons sailing from the port of Manila to the port of Acapulco, as noted, on the west coast of Mexico. Direct trade with Spain and Europe in general was established during this era in 1766. Expeditions to and from the islands were administered from 1785 onward by the Real Compañía Filipina, which was granted a monopoly to trade between Spain and the islands that lasted until 1834, when the company was terminated by the Spanish crown due to poor management and financial losses. Indeed, The Philippines was never profitable as a colony under the Spanish, and the long war against the Dutch in the 17th century, along with the intermittent conflict with the Muslims in the south, nearly bankrupted the colonial treasury. The royal officer in charge of finances in Manila, in fact, wrote a letter to King Charles III of Spain in which he advised him to abandon the colony. The Philippines, nonetheless, survived on an annual subsidy paid by the Spanish crown. And what we're looking at here is an image of the cathedral in Manila, the Catholic cathedral in Manila, as it appeared in the 18th century. So it was established prior to this, but this is what it had been expanded into and looked like in the 18th century. All right, British invasion. We're not talking about the Beatles here. During the 18th century, Britain declared war against Spain on January 4, 1762. And on September 24, 1762, a force of British Army regulars and British East India Company soldiers, supported by the ships and men of the East Indies Squadron of the British Royal Navy, sailed into Manila Bay from Madras, India. Manila fell to the British on October 4, 1762. Part of what made the rapid British success possible was that the 200-year-old fortifications at Manila had not been improved much since they had first been built by the early Spanish, largely as a result of the limited financial resources of the colony. British forces were, however, confined to Manila and the nearby port of Cavite by the resistance organized by the Provisional Spanish colonial government. Suffering a breakdown of command and troop desertions as a result of their failure to secure control of the Philippines, the British ended their occupation of Manila by sailing away in April 1764 as agreed to in peace negotiations in Europe. And at left, we're just seeing some of the route of the British troop movements in the Philippines on Luzon. And at right, we're looking at the gate that the Spanish governor escaped through carrying treasury and documents when the British captured Manila. And that's something that some of us will presumably be able to see today or tomorrow, especially if we're on one of the organized tours in Manila. And just for the record, I have made effort to ensure that the images I'm showing you tie in with the era that we're talking about. So we are looking at a 19th century photograph here. We are looking at a 19th century map. So I've tried to make sure that what you're looking at is true to the era that we're talking about. I mean, probably most people don't care that much, but I try to do due diligence with these things. During the 19th century, Spain invested heavily in the Philippines. Many infrastructure projects were undertaken during this period, which put the Philippine economy and standard of living ahead of most of its Asian neighbors and even many European countries at the time. Among them were a railway system for Luzon, a tramcar network for Manila, and Asia's first steel suspension bridge, now called Puente Colgante, which we can see here on the left in a period photograph. Through the Education Decree of December 20, 1863, Queen Isabella II of Spain decreed the establishment of a free public school system that used Spanish as the language of instruction, leading to increasing numbers of educated Filipinos. Additionally, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 cut travel time to Spain significantly, which facilitated the rise of the ilustrados, an enlightened class of Filipinos that was able to expand their studies in Spain and Europe. Spanish Manila was seen in the 19th century as a model of colonial governance that effectively put the interests of the original inhabitants of the islands before those of the colonial power, which, frankly, you don't see anywhere else in the Spanish colonial world to any extent. In 1900, the year Spain left the Philippines, its residents were the second richest in Asia, just a little behind Japan and far ahead of China and India. So as a colony, the Philippines is not producing a lot for the mother country, but as far as standard of living for its people go, it's pretty good by 19th century Asian standards. So I think that's interesting. And certainly, as noted, the exception to the rule. Revolutionary sentiments arose in 1872 after 3 Filipino priests, who you can see there at right, that is a photo of them, or an etching, were accused of sedition by colonial authorities and executed. This would inspire the propaganda movement, which clamored for adequate representation to the Spanish legislature and later for independence. Radical intellectual ilustrados wrote novels that greatly inspired the movement for independence, and the Katipunan, a secret society whose primary purpose was overthrowing Spanish rule in the Philippines, was founded. The Philippine Revolution itself began in 1896. So pretty late, moving up into modern times. Began in 1896 amidst executions of suspected dissidents and with infighting and even fratricide among the insurgent groups themselves. So the insurgent groups are fighting the Spanish colonial government. They're fighting each other. And some of them are even exiled and forced to leave the Philippines in the midst of all of this violence that's outbreaking toward the end of the 19th century. Armed conflict broke out in almost every Spanish-governed province in the Philippines during this period. In 1898, as conflict continued in the Philippines, the Spanish-American War broke out, and U.S. Navy Commodore George Dewey led naval forces to defeat the Spanish squadron at Manila. So the Spanish-American War, of course, everyone knows this was precipitated by the explosion of the Maine, the sinking of the Maine, which was a U.S. vessel in Havana Harbor, and it led to Teddy Roosevelt raising a group of soldiers called the Rough Riders, who went on to fame at the Battle of San Juan Hill in Puerto Rico. So that's all this era, but it's a global conflict. We mostly know about the Spanish-American War as it pertains to the Western Hemisphere and what happened in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but it's happening out here in the vicinity of the Philippines as well. By the time U.S. land forces arrived in the Philippines, the Filipino revolutionaries had taken control of the entire island of Luzon except for the walled city of Intramuros. On June 12, 1898, revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo declared the independence of the Philippines, establishing the first Philippine Republic under Asia's first democratic constitution. Although at that point, much of the former colony still remained under the control of Spain. So they've declared independence, but they haven't declared victory quite yet. 7 months later, in February 1899, U.S. forces captured Manila from the Spanish. The Battle of Manila marked an end to Philippine-American collaboration, however, as Filipino forces were prevented from entering the captured city, an action that they deeply resented. Spain and the United States sent commissioners to Paris to draw up the terms of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War. But the Filipino representative was excluded from sessions, and the revolutionary government was not recognized by the family of nations. Despite substantial domestic opposition in the United States, the U.S. decided to annex the Philippines, and Spain was forced to hand it over, along with Guam and Puerto Rico, in exchange for $20 million. So $20 million in 1900 or so is a lot of money, but really not that much compared to snapping up 3 premium pieces of real estate around the world. U.S. President McKinley justified the annexation of the Philippines by saying that it was a gift from the gods, and that since they were unfit for self-government, there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, in spite of the Philippines having already been Christianized and educated by the Spanish over the course of several centuries. So this apparently played with the American people at the turn of the century because they knew what they were hearing, but they didn't really actually know what was happening in other parts of the world like the Philippines. So they just assumed that the Filipinos were all just sacrificing coconuts to idols or something, rather than, for the most part, being a Christianized nation for centuries already. During the Revolution, Filipinos perceived their relationship with the United States as that of two nations joined in a common struggle against Spain. The United States ultimately distanced itself from the Filipino insurgents, however, and would not commit to support for Philippine independence. Relations deteriorated and tensions heightened as it became clear that the Americans were on the islands to stay. Hostilities broke out on February 4, 1899, after 2 American soldiers killed 3 Filipino troops in a Manila suburb, an incident that sparked the Philippine-American War, which would cost much more money and take far more lives than the Spanish-American War had. Some 126,000 Americans served in the conflict. 126,000 Americans served in the Philippine-American War, and 4,234 of them were killed, as were between 12,000 and 20,000 Philippine Republican Army soldiers. And we say between 12,000 and 20,000 Philippine Republican Army soldiers because they were fighting largely a guerrilla war, so the number that were actually killed in the course of it is somewhat vague. Remember all the inflated body counts that were getting reported in the Vietnam War? Same thing. That was not a new invention. It was being done in the Philippine-American War as well. The general population, caught between the Americans and the rebels, suffered significantly, and at least 200,000 Filipino civilians died directly or indirectly as a result of the war, many of them from the cholera epidemic that broke out toward the end of the conflict. Atrocities were committed by both sides. Poorly equipped Filipino troops were easily defeated by American forces in open combat, but they were formidable opponents in guerrilla warfare. One by one, however, U.S. forces captured the revolutionary strongholds. Several key Filipino commanders were killed, sometimes by fratricide, not by the Americans. And in March 1901, Aguinaldo himself was captured and brought to Manila. Convinced of the futility of further resistance, he swore allegiance to the United States and issued a proclamation calling on his compatriots to surrender, officially bringing an end to the war. Sporadic resistance continued in various parts of the Philippines, however, especially in the Muslim South, until 1913, some 12 years later. And this is an interesting print. This is a U.S. Army print, and it shows U.S. Army soldiers fighting Filipino troops, or fighting Moros in the Muslim South, sometime from 1911 onward. You could see over there on the right a couple of the helmets we talked about earlier, okay? So these are the helmets that we saw being used by Moros in the 16th century. They're still using the same pattern helmet now in the early 20th century. And how do we know it's from 1911 onward? Because the officer there has a model 1911 .45 caliber automatic pistol, which really became popular and widespread during the Philippine-American War because the American troops on the ground in the Philippines needed something that had a lot of knockdown power, and the .38 caliber revolvers that the officers had been carrying didn't have that kind of knockdown. So the .45 caliber automatic became the standard U.S. Army sidearm during the Philippine-American War because something with a lot of knockdown was necessary when fighting these very fierce Moros in particular. On July 1, 1901, William Howard Taft, who was to become president, of course, head of the commission tasked with legislating laws and re-engineering the Philippine political system, was inaugurated as civil governor, with military rule continuing in areas where insurrection persisted. The Taft Commission passed laws establishing the fundamentals of the new government, including a judicial system, civil service, and local government. A Philippine constabulary was organized to deal with the remnants of the insurgent movement and gradually assume military responsibilities. So once the Americans have conquered the Philippines, they really undo the entire structure that the Spanish had put in place and had persisted for 3 centuries, and reinvent things in their own image. So the basis of Philippine government was completely reconfigured during this era, early 20th century, 1901 onward. We could see Taft there in the middle of this fuzzy but authentic period photograph. During the ensuing era, the Philippines was administered by the insular government, what was referred to as the insular government, so called because it fell under the authority of the U.S. Bureau of Insular Affairs. This government saw its mission as one of preparing the Philippines for eventual independence. On July 4, 1902, the office of military governor was abolished and full executive power passed to Taft, who became the first U.S. Governor General of the Philippines. An elected Philippine Assembly was inaugurated in 1907 as the lower house of a bicameral legislature, so modeled on that of the United States, with the appointed Philippine Commission serving as an upper house. So there was no Senate, there was an appointed commission serving in place of a Senate initially. Then, in 1916, the U.S. Congress passed a law providing for the election of both houses of the Philippine legislature and laying the groundwork for independence. In socioeconomic terms, the Philippines made solid progress in this period. By 1920, foreign trade had increased to nearly 10 times what it had been 25 years earlier in 1895. So that's did a lot for the economy of the Philippines. A healthcare system was established, which by 1930 reduced the mortality rate from all causes, including various tropical diseases, to a level similar to that in the United States itself. A new educational system was established with English as the medium of instruction. Slavery, piracy, and headhunting were suppressed, although not entirely eradicated. So 100 years ago in the Philippines, we were still dealing with slavery, piracy, and headhunting in areas that were not under strict control of U.S. Government, or the insular government that was supported by the U.S., administered by the U.S. The 1920s saw alternating periods of cooperation and confrontation with American governors general, depending on how intent they were on exercising their powers vis-a-vis the Philippine legislature. Members to the legislature lobbied for immediate and complete independence from the United States, and several independence missions were sent to Washington, D.C. A civil service was formed and was gradually taken over by Filipinos who had effectively gained control of the bureaucracy by 1918. When World War I broke out, the Philippines offered to supply a division of troops and fund construction of 2 warships on behalf of the U.S. cause. A locally recruited National Guard was created, and significant numbers of Filipinos also volunteered for service in the U.S. Armed Forces. In 1935, the office of Governor General of the Philippines was changed to U.S. High Commissioner of the Philippines in preparation for the transition to independence. Just checking my time. I have my wife down here keeping me from going over. The Great Depression in the early 30s hastened the progress of Philippine independence. After much deliberation on both sides, in 1934, the U.S. Congress passed the Tydings-McDuffie Act, which provided for the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines with transition to full independence after 10 years. This Commonwealth would have its own constitution and be self-governing, although foreign policy would be the responsibility of the United States, and certain legislation required approval of the U.S. president. A constitutional convention was convened in Manila on July 30, 1934. On February 8, 1935, the 1935 Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines was approved by the convention by a vote of 177 to 1, approved by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who we can see here in the middle, on March 23, 1935, and ratified by popular vote on May 14, 1935. And those of you who know anything about FDR know that he had suffered from polio when he was younger. He was generally confined to a wheelchair, but he did not like to be photographed in a wheelchair, and when he posed for a photograph, was usually seen standing, propped up or with braces or whatever. But he did not want to project in any way that he was infirm, and made a big point of, when he posed for photographs, standing, so that he did not look like he was in any way in any way that would shake the confidence of the American people. And of course, he was a brilliant president. On September 17, 1935, presidential elections were held, and Manuel N. Quezon and Sergio Osmeña of the Nacionalista Party were proclaimed the winners of the presidency and vice presidency, respectively. The Commonwealth government of the Philippines was inaugurated on the morning of November 15, 1935, and full independence was set for July 4, 1946, a timetable that was followed despite the dramatic events that were to follow. What are those dramatic events? World War II. So we're toward the end of our presentation here. Unless someone from the ship actually comes and starts waggling at me, we're just going to run through to the end of this before tying up. Japan launched a surprise attack on American Clark Air Base in the Philippines on the morning of December 8, 1941, just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Aerial bombardment was followed by landings of ground troops on Luzon. Defending Philippine and U.S. troops were under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, and under the pressure of superior numbers, withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor at the entrance to Manila Bay. On January 2, 1942, MacArthur declared the capital, Manila, an open city to prevent its destruction. Defense continued until the final surrender of U.S. Philippine forces on the Bataan Peninsula in April 1942, and on Corregidor the following month. Most of the 80,000 prisoners of war captured by the Japanese at Bataan were forced to undertake the infamous Bataan Death March to a prison camp 63 miles to the north. And about 10,000 Filipinos and 1,200 Americans died before reaching it. President Quezon and Vice President Osmeña fled to the United States, where they set up a government in exile. MacArthur was ordered to Australia, where he started to plan for a return to the Philippines. Japanese military authorities immediately began organizing a new government structure in the Philippines and established the Philippine Executive Commission and a Council of State, through which they directed civil affairs until October 1943, when they declared the Philippines an independent republic, although they were still occupying it. Japanese occupation of the Philippines was opposed by large-scale underground guerrilla activity, and U.S. and Philippine forces continued to fight the Japanese and pro-Japanese paramilitary forces in a guerrilla war. Their effectiveness was such that by the end of the war, Japan controlled only 12 of the island's 48 provinces. In October 1944, Allied forces and the Japanese waged the largest naval battle in history in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. U.S. Army forces landed on Leyte that month, and landings in other parts of the country followed. Fighting, however, continued until Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945. And really a little later than that, some of you might remember some Japanese soldiers being found on isolated islands as late as the 1970s because they never heard the war ended and they just kept living out in the jungle waiting to battle the Americans when they showed up. 10 months later, on July 4, 1946, the United States ceded its sovereignty over the islands, and the Republic of the Philippines became an independent nation, and that is where we will conclude our talk. Thank you for coming today. I hope you enjoyed that. And we've run over, so I've got to hustle out of here. But I am available to talk today on my excursion,